Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our fourth and final workshop. Let's talk about walking the path of anti-racism. My name is Stephanie Fong, and along with Allison Tanaka, we will be facilitating today's workshop for you. Since we don't have time to go around and do introductions for everyone, please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, pronouns, and temple, if applicable. So you can go ahead and do that while we walk through community agreements.
Thank you, Steph. Hi everyone, I'm Allison. So we'll be going through our community agreements right now, and we just made this list and ask that everyone follows them so that we can ensure this is a safe space for everyone. The first on our list is one mic. Make sure you are not speaking over anyone and making sure that you're jumping in when it is all right to do so. The second is right thought and right view. Assume that those who are speaking are coming from positive intent. The third is right speech, understanding that our words have power and can negatively affect others. Understanding that our words can be taken a different way, and just to be cognizant of what we're saying and being mindful of that. And then the fourth is right action. What is shared here stays here, and what is learned here leaves here. Some people might be sharing personal stories, and we just want to be just aware of that and make sure that their stories and what they're sharing is not being shared out of the space that we're in, and what is learned here that you take into your everyday life and apply it to as you go along with anti-racism. And the fifth is right mindfulness, and this is to create space and take space. In our discussion portion, maybe if you're not speaking as much, maybe think about sharing a little bit more if you're comfortable, and then being aware that if you are speaking a lot in your group, maybe stepping back and allowing other people to share. If you have anything else that you'd like to add to this list we've created, please add them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we uphold that later on.
Because this is our last workshop, we wanted to kick it off with a brief reflection on our last 3 workshops and how they brought us to the conversation that we're having today. You might have already heard us say this or connected the dots already, but we decided to frame this workshop series around the 4 Noble Truths. Our first workshop, Why Black Lives Matter in a World Full of Suffering, focused on what the movement is, the prevalence of racism and lack of anti-racism in our own communities, and ultimately validating and centering that Black lives matter, even if arguably we are all suffering in some way. Workshop 2, Systemic Racism That Causes Suffering in the Black Community, asked and answered why the Black community is suffering. We focused on calling out many of the institutions and systems that uphold racism, and how our values and biases work to uphold this racist and unjust system. We covered systems such as redlining, the school-to-prison pipeline, government surveillance, incarceration, drug arrests, and more, with the goal of highlighting disproportionality. But we also took this time to start the internal reflection on our own implicit biases and stereotypes that need to be addressed and relearned as we move forward as anti-racist individuals. Like the 3rd Noble Truth states, there is an end to suffering. The 3rd workshop, A Future Without Suffering, highlighted the main institutions and systems that need to be reformed and or removed from society, and how we can do that with governmental policies and budget changes. We covered mutual aid, reparations, defunding the police, the Breathe Act, voting rights, restorative justice, and prison abolition. All changes that need to start now, but cannot be expected to change overnight. That's where workshop 4 and the 4th Noble Truth comes in. Within ourselves and within our communities, it is our hope that whether through these workshops, other workshops, or through your own self-education, you've begun walking the path towards living an anti-racist life. It's been over 2,000 years since Siddhartha first discovered the 4 Noble Truths, and to no one's surprise, we're all still suffering. That being said, we cannot expect to reach the end of our path towards an anti-racist livelihood and society in our lifetimes, let alone the mere 3 months that have passed since George Floyd was murdered by the police. Today, keep in mind the Eightfold path as you move through our discussion. on our personal paths and community paths towards being anti-racist. Often, we must self-educate and self-reflect to attain the right view on the situation in order to form the most appropriate reactions and opinions. Once we have formed our stances, we will then feel more comfortable to speak up and take action physically and verbally when confronted with racism and the institutions that uphold it. Anti-racism needs to be sustainable and must be incorporated into our daily practices that come in many forms. We will be tired, and at times we may feel like we've done our share, but with the right effort, we keep going because suffering must be alleviated from everyone and not just ourselves. By continuing to center and uplift the Black community in our efforts, we can best continue on our path towards an anti-racist society that dismantles the inequality and inequity that plagues it.
In this first part, we'll be breaking down our own personal path to anti-racism. We felt that we cannot go forward without understanding where we are in our journey with race and what identities we hold which grant us privileges and disadvantages. Being actively anti-racist starts with deep self-reflection, and we have to look into ourselves before we can help others. Angela Davis said this quote here, which says, "In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist." So this is what our journey with understanding race and social justice may look like. First is awareness. We may see something we don't agree with on the news or view injustice right in front of our eyes. And these experiences awaken us to the inequalities in our society and lead us to the second stage of empathy. Empathy is our ability to feel and a desire to connect with those experiencing injustices. When we see police brutality and violence, we may empathize with others, their families, and the communities who are suffering. From these deep feelings that we're feeling, we sense the motivation to change and to act and respond. The third step is our hearts and minds change. We begin to develop our right view and right thought, and our mindset changes into what we really believe in. Once we have the genuine mindset, we can, our actions and behaviors change, and we begin to move more. We begin to be more mindful of our actions that we take, and think further into what we can do for the greater society. This may look like physical actions or implementing ways to combat white supremacy in our everyday lives. So those steps can also be divided into these zones. Using this graphic, our path to anti-racism can be divided as such: the fear zone, the learning zone, and then the growth zone. The fear zone can include denying racism as a problem, fearing being uncomfortable, refusing to challenge others, and remaining in a circle of people who are just like you. Once you break out of that fear zone, you enter into the next, which is the learning zone. And this includes recognizing racism, realizing privileges, stepping into uncomfortability, and being vulnerable when recognizing our own faults and mistakes. Because I'm sure in our past that we'll be making a bunch of mistakes, and that's totally okay. From the learning zone, we move into the growth zone, which includes acknowledging the way in which we unknowingly benefit from racism, advocating for policies and leaders that are anti-racist, speaking out and holding others accountable, and surrounding ourselves around diverse thinkers and all types of people. We all come from our own backgrounds and experiences, and that may determine what point or what zone that we're at this moment. And this means that we may want to progress in different aspects as well, depending where we are all at. This path is not one that is necessarily linear. We may move back and forth, going from maybe growth and then reverting back to learning, and that's totally okay. And we may be even in more than one zone at the same time. But our goal with this these zones here is to always just strive towards growth and to know that this process is lifelong and is always continuous. We cannot stop at one point. And now I would like to ask everyone to self-reflect a little bit and where you are in your path with anti-racism. Please feel free to take a couple moments to think and maybe even write down what zones you think you're at and how you want to grow in that spot. Maybe there are specific actions that you'd like to take part in, or maybe you'd like to educate yourself on something in particular. And your answers will come up in the discussion portion, so it'd be nice to come back to those and share out if you'd like. And while you're thinking, I would just like to give a little bit of my perspective and my experience. In my perspective, my personal path has not been linear and has not necessarily been easy. It wasn't until I entered college that I began to recognize the privileges with my generational and East Asian identity, and starting to think critically about race disparities and having those conversations with my peers. Over the past couple years, I've developed a greater understanding of correct terminologies to use and histories, not only the histories that we learned in our K through 12 education, but what those stories look like for our AAPI folks and also Black histories. And I moved from my fear zone to learning zone when it comes to acknowledging that systemic racism exists. But sometimes I revert back to the fear zone when people around me are covertly judgmental or racist, and I'm still working through navigating around those situations. I hope to grow actively in uplifting those who are marginalized and advocating against injustice when I see it. So feel free to kind of think about these zones as we go on, but we'll be moving on to the next topics.
Before we take action, it helps if we understand our positionality and the privileges we may hold because of our identities. Positionality refers to our position in the social hierarchy. This determines our access to social, political, and economic resources. For example, middle-class Japanese Americans usually sit higher than their Black counterparts in the social hierarchy because of their proximity to whiteness. Therefore, they usually sit in seats of power and can use that position to voice the needs of Black lives. Intersectionality can be adopted into many facets of our lives. It acknowledges that an individual is multidimensional and complex, and that each of their social identities and its positional effect intersect with one another. Our intersected identities, in turn, shape our life conditions and interactions with one another. Our identities grant us privileges as well as disadvantages. Oh, sorry, too far. This graphic builds off of Reverend Matt's visual in Workshop 1, which displays the systems of inequalities as a coin. At the top, there are identities that hold privilege and are reinforced by social norms. On the bottom, the categories hold more disadvantages and are often the traits of oppressed groups in our society. This serves to display the intersectionality of our identities, which cannot limit us to one category or treatment by society. As you might notice, identities such as wealthy, credentialed, and able-bodied are labeled as privileges and social normatives at the top of the circle. But notice that race, especially being Black or of other non-European origin, is an identity found at the opposite hemisphere of the circle. This goes to show how the intersectionality of our identities can determine our treatment by society. Just because you're wealthy, able-bodied, maybe you have a PhD, society will still treat you as less because of the color of your skin.
And breaking down our identity further, we must understand the privilege as a model minority. Although it negatively represents Asian Americans and doesn't even include Southeast Asians and South Asians, the myth also negatively impacts all other minority groups. The model minority myth wrongfully upholds anti-Blackness and glamorizes the Asian American life as white adjacent. It undercuts the years of Black power activism by saying Asians can pull themselves out of oppression and assimilate to white supremacy. Other minorities can do the same, and systemic racism is not the issue. When we reject to be a model minority in the midst of white supremacy, we are breaking away from the decades of stereotypes that are forced onto us. We are not the whiz kid or the crazy rich Asian that society wants us to be, but we can become a minority that uses our privilege to uplift the other minorities that we unknowingly have suppressed. The premise of the model minority myth. And next, in supporting the movement for Black lives, there have been many posters that intend to express their solidarity, like these shown on the slide. And the art on the screen reads, Buddhists for Black Lives and Yellow Peril supports Black Power. Many of these slogans have surfaced in efforts of activism. However, they must be cautioned because they center the AAPI identity before Black lives. Specifically, Yellow Peril supports Black Power was used at a time for Asian Americans to unite with Black Power activists against oppressive forces. The term Yellow Peril is also not inclusive to Asian Americans who do not identify as yellow or East Asian. Manyi Chow, the artist of the Yellow Peril Supports Black Power poster on the slide, said, people have to center Black liberation and freedom in their politics and in their practice. That's what it means to be in solidarity. It's not going to be easy, but that's part of the work. Racial solidarity is a goal that requires struggle. And this just serves as a reminder as we should always center the conversation around the Black community. Efforts of activism may be new to many of us as there is a new momentum of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Others may have lived through years of activism, and all these experiences are valid. Taking part in this work means that we are centering it around Black voices, uplifting those rather than taking space for ourselves. We need to understand and work to meet the needs and demands of Black and Brown organizers. Our efforts must come back to the movement for Black liberation. And to close off this first part, Ijeoma Oluo said, the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward. And with that, we hope that we can set everyone off to kind of discussing where they're at and what they can do to progress in this movement and in their own path to anti-racism. So we ask that people kind of share out about what their personal path may look like and how you want to move further and what are like the type of actions that you want to start incorporating in your life. And then referring back to the Eightfold Path, how can understanding the Eightfold Path help you with you and the actions that you want to take? And I believe we'll be in the first discussion for about 25 minutes for the first one. So, and then we'll come back and share out.
The second half of this workshop will have two parts. In the second section, we'll be first laying out. Oh, sorry. Yes.
I think we're sharing out from our first discussion.
You're right. You're right. Ignore me. Ignore me, guys.
No, it's okay.
That, Allison.
Sure. So should we stay in? Should we go into gallery mode?
Oh
yeah, maybe go back to the questions. That'd be helpful.
Okay, I can do either.
Okay. So actually, I'll throw it back to you, Steph. Do you want to go first in sharing out like what your group kind of talked about, or someone from your group?
Yeah, I mean, does anyone in my group want to share out? So that was like Koki, Anna, Billy, Kayla. Are any of you guys interested in kind of like either like sharing your perspective or like the perspective of our group? If not, go ahead. Okay, so we all went through our zones. We started out like walking through our zones and kind of talking about like what parts of like our own experience like fall into like the learning or the growth zone, and you know how we kind of move back and forth between those as individuals. We talked through a little bit more about, you know, the intersectionality of like our different identities, you know, how that really reflects in the things that we recognize about ourselves, almost as like what we personally see as injustice and what we may not recognize as injustice because it doesn't directly affect us. We got a little bit into, you know, how like our economic status like can reflect whether or not we see injustice in it at first. And then we kind of like rounded out our discussion with kind of talking about the poster Yellow Peril, or Yellow Peril supports Black Power, like what that messaging like really means, like what it means to, you know, not center our own experiences, but not to invalidate our experiences, because I think we were trying to navigate that balance between like, you know, using what we know to best like to find like injustices and to like, you know, really like move towards change. But yeah, just that balance, we were really navigating that and like how to like incorporate that into our community, which we'll talk about in the next section.
Thanks, Steph. Marissa, does your group want to go next?
Sure. Does anyone from my group want to share something? If not, I can. Okay. So we talked a lot about like our personal paths and talking about like how we can get more involved now. And yeah, we talked kind of, the thing that was like very interesting is at the end, Ellen brought up how like we can deal with like anger, especially like when we're talking with people that we don't agree with. And we were talking about how we can, I guess, question that anger and kind of like understand why people are angry, and then that's like one way that we can like start understanding people more and maybe like getting to a more of an understanding with someone. Yeah.
Thanks, Marissa. Devin's group.
Does anyone from my group want to share? No. Oh, we talked about you know, how those stages that you're in, you know, it's not linear. It's more like sometimes depending on the situation, you'll move back and forth between the zone, because, you know, maybe you won't feel as comfortable or you are confident. And then we talked a lot about that. And then we had also talked about, you know, Asians being considered people of color, or if they aren't considered people of color. So yeah, that's what we talked about.
Reverend Matt's group.
Does anyone from our group want to say anything? Nope. Okay. So in our group, we had some people that were maybe on the wiser side. So that was very interesting to hear how going through life, learning about the different actions that we could take, because it wasn't just from the Asian point of view or people of color point of view, but then also from as white people learning, that kind of culture and understanding the things to do, the best way to participate, to support the community. It is this lifelong journey where we're continuously trying to learn and then also combating these kind of feelings within ourselves of being afraid to put ourselves in harm's way, afraid of offending other people unintentionally, even if we have these compassionate intentions, but still working through all of that and being able to do something. So it's this constant struggle to learn, to understand, to try to figure out, what other people are feeling, why they are supporting certain things, and then trying to put ourselves aside so we can help to the greater good for these other marginalized peoples.
Thank you, Matt. And then lastly, Tara's group.
Everyone in my group, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in if I miss anything. But we had a really great discussion. We all kind of talked about, how we're sort of in that learning, growing, kind of in both, and really looked at kind of like what, in terms of the actions, kind of like how can we educate ourselves, and also kind of, we had a lot of great questions come up in the group around like, sometimes it's really tiring to kind of have all of this news, or really tiring to be on social media and seeing all these things, and how to kind of balance that with other ways to kind of support the movement, maybe instead supporting different like YouTube people or organizations that are Black owned. So just finding other ways to kind of engage in these conversations and other ways to be involved. Yeah, anyone feel free to chime in if I missed anything. And thank you.
I think Tara also shared a really helpful like resource as well. I think she said where'd you get it from again, Tara? It was like, I think from a UC Davis like seminar or something like that. That I thought it was really cool. It had like a lot of like different like resources and stuff from both like BIPOC community and like stuff like that. So I don't know. Yeah, I thought it was cool.
And then I'll just share for my group really quick before we go into break. But all of the people in my group had a lot of interesting things to share, and we were all like at different places, like in our zones. But the notes that I wrote down are making sure that we're not staying too comfortable in educating ourselves, because we can, read all the books and, listen to all the educators and kind of stay up to date. But we have to do that work too. We have to, act on that and take those next steps forward. And then also, Stephanie from my group mentioned directly reaching out to the local Black Lives Matter chapter and like asking for their needs. And she is currently working with them with training and then taking further steps. So I thought that was awesome. And yeah, that was kind of my group, some of the points from my group. And I think right now we'll go into a 5-minute break. Just take a stretch or get some water, and we'll come back around 11:11.
Half of this workshop is going to have 2 parts. And in this second section, we're going to be laying out some examples of actions that you can incorporate into your daily life and adopt as you progress along your path to anti-racism. So we hope this will kind of round out part one and give you some more concrete ideas for actions that you may or may not have considered already. This chart of sustainable actions that might help you determine what is feasible for you right now, what you want to do, or types of actions that you haven't previously considered. Note that this is definitely not an exhaustive list. It's made up of multiple sources, which are going to be listed at the end of this presentation. And it is made up of items that we felt would be most relevant to you, our participants today. So when considering actions we can take, they may fall on a spectrum of internal and external actions, self-education and educating others, or giving time or monetary donations. For example, some educational actions you could take are consuming content from Black creators and educators, or advocating for the integration of Black history in K-12 education. Anti-racism can also be incorporated into your path by redistributing wealth back into the hands of Black individuals. Some examples are buying from Black and brown businesses and being cognizant of buying from companies that use prison labor, have a white supremacist agenda, or exploit workers of color. Money is not always a feasible option for some individuals, but service is really great because you're donating time. This can look like supporting local grassroots organizations or bearing witness and speaking up for a BIPOC person if they're being stopped by the police, since the police are more inclined to rethink their actions in the presence of white people or people of white adjacency.
And for participating in the dialogue and continuing the conversation, some things to note from the list are starting conversations with non-Black friends on race. There's a lot more going on than the weather right now, so it might be good to address those and kind of talk about them. And uplifting voices of people of marginalized identities. And this can be through social media or through publications. For political and social actions to dismantle the racism in our system. Their strength comes from numbers, and this looks like protesting or participating in rallies or marches, or signing petitions, contacting representatives, and really importantly, voting on the local level. On this chart is actively relearning and changing our own mindset. And this is crucial in sustainability. This includes debunking stereotypes, understanding and acknowledging the implicit bias we had. We had a conversation about that a couple workshops ago, and just overall kind of understanding our positionality and privilege to uplift others.
So we're going to send you that chart in the Zoom chat. Alice, if you could just go ahead and do that. There was a lot in it, and there's a lot of great resources and suggestions in there, so we want you to be able to refer back to it and absorb it more if you want to. And with that, we hope this rounded out some of your conversations and thoughts that you may have had in part one. And keep this in mind as we dive into the path of anti-racism for our community. Who and what makes up our community? This graphic by Daniel Koch is a great way to think about community as our sphere of influence. Our community is not just one homogeneous group of people, and the racism embedded in these various institutions and places must be addressed, reformed, or dismantled in different ways. In this post and this graphic, the author breaks up one sphere of influence into these sectors: home, church, government, school, business, and work. It is important to recognize that each institution has its own goal and its own potential steps to reaching it. Even our Buddhist community will have a different goal and path than perhaps a church that worships God. Throughout our paths, we will discover our capabilities in influencing these different sections of our community. Some may start with what's closest to home, or where they feel most comfortable inciting and incorporating change into their everyday lives. All of these are valid approaches and actions. Determine where you might need the most work, and determine start points by which institutions in your life you feel you have the most influence over. Keep this graphic in mind as we dive deeper into our temple communities and harnessing our identities as Buddhists for change. It is important to remember that each of these systems are interdependent on one another. We cannot dismantle racism only where it affects us, or where it is convenient for us, if that is our temple communities. Start where you're the least uncomfortable, so that you may step further into areas where you are even more unfamiliar. Religious communities in particular often cling to traditions and resist change. But hasn't Buddhism told us that everything is constantly changing, and that we're all interdependent on one another, and that we should be compassionate in everything that we do? Following the death of George Floyd and the strong resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, several temple leaders, for example, Reverend Harry Gyoko Bridge, Reverend Tadao Koyama, and Reverend Matthew Hamasaki, all stepped forward to help start that conversation in the Buddhist community that otherwise has been ignored or pushed aside. Simply in the words of Reverend Harry Gyoko Bridge, Buddhists are not immune from racism. Regardless of how many Sunday services we go to, how much we learn about interdependence, impermanence, compassion, and other teachings that are very close to the heart of the religion we practice, we must hold ourselves responsible for the lack of inclusivity, our inaction, and our removal from society's issues under the premise that our Buddhist way of life exempts us from intervention and taking a firm stance against racism. This quote from Reverend Tadao Koyama's article, "Are We Too Comfortable in Our Buddhism?" helps to put our position as Buddhists in today's societies into perspective. He says, "Speaking in very general terms for Jodo Shinshu Buddhists in the United States of America, our usual services consist only of Sunday family services where we all gather and have a service. Have we, as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, become too comfortable in having this as the extent of Buddhism in our lives? The Sunday service, the Dharma talk, is this all it means to be Buddhist in this world?" Regardless of whether you can identify with this, quote, modern day Jodo Shinshu Buddhist lifestyle, it still speaks to the level of complacency we have reached when considering the temple community outside of the 2 or 3 hours we spend there every Sunday morning. While mistakes will be made, whether by us, our fellow Sangha members, or our community as a whole, it is ultimately our responsibility to try and recognize those mistakes and change our views and actions as time progresses and new ideologies emerge. One aspect of our temple communities to consider is our Sangha. Just as we must have the right view and the right thought before considering what our actions and speech will look like, a community must look internally before devising external actions. If you are a member of a temple community, please take the time to self-reflect on the following questions and take note of any situations that might come to mind. If you're not a member of a temple community, then feel free to apply these questions to the people in your workplace, school, or any other aspect of your community. Consider, who does your Sangha consist of? What do they look like? And do they share similar beliefs and values to each other and to you? Does discussion ever arise in your temple community about members outside of your Sangha? For example, homelessness like surrounding the temple community. What is typically the tone of those conversations? Are they negative or are they positive? And finally, what barriers, both physical and mental, stop us from reaching out to the surrounding community, and thus those in need? With this in mind, it is only fair to ask then, can a Sangha extend beyond what we typically define it to be? If our temple communities intend to work towards becoming anti-racist, promoting inclusivity, and calling in the community around us, then it must. One of the steps that have to be taken towards creating an inclusive community and an anti-racist Sangha is surrounding ourselves with people who think and look differently than ourselves. Change can only go so far internally, since these internal changes are only meant to orient us towards external change and action. While we all individually assume a role in our community's changes, it is important to understand how much work really needs to be done. To better understand our community's position, we can break it down into the same kind of zones that we have considered in part 1. As we go through some examples of what the fear, learning, and growth zones can look like in a community, especially in our temple communities, keep in mind the intersection between our personal path and our community's path can and probably will be at different points. While we may no longer deny the prevalence of racism, it is probable that our communities or a majority of their membership might. This can be frustrating when we want things to move as fast as we do or change to come as fast as we want it to. But we have to remember that our work as individuals cannot end when we all of a sudden deem ourselves anti-racist or feel that something or someone is unchangeable. The following slides will outline examples of each zone. This is in no way applicable to every temple community or any community, and it is not an exhaustive list of examples and experiences that you might have had yourself. In a temple community, the fear zone can sound or look like, we need to take care of our own, or that's not our problem since they're not our temple members. Or maybe you've heard, I'm uncomfortable because this temple visitor doesn't look like me, or look like a Buddhist, as I define it. It can also look like separating the temple from the greater community that it resides in, especially if the temple is in a low-income neighborhood or in an area with high poverty and homelessness rates. It can also look like upholding the community's racial bias by validating their feelings and opinions when they are uncomfortable by topics of inclusivity and race, or people that don't look like them. The learning zone in a community can look like recognizing that there is a bias towards temple members who are Asian American and middle class. It can look like releasing statements of inclusivity and committing to action plans within the greater community that the temple is located in. It can be encouraging temple leadership to educate themselves about race, bias, privilege, structural racism, etc., so they can be better prepared to do the work at the forefront of structural change in their community. Finally, it can also look like actively reaching out to visitors or temple goers who do not look like the majority of Jodo Shinshu and Asian congregants with the intent of welcoming them into our Sangha. Finally, the community growth zone can look something like this. It can be including and uplifting the community outside of our immediate temple members and using our own resources to help meet their needs. It is maintaining and expanding initiatives that our community implements, for example, community fridges, drop-off boxes, and other acts of service. It is continuously revisiting and revising action plans to ensure that they still reflect the needs of the Black community and are still being followed. It is then educating temple members about race, bias, privilege, structural racism, etc., whether it's through Dharma talks, articles, workshops, classes, and more. And the hope that when we do that, temple members will no longer be bystanders to racism when they see it in their own Sangha and will speak out and take action against it.
So these are just some ideas of what anti-racism in our local communities could look like. Stephanie already outlined some of these, but we have statements for intersectionality and commitments to inclusive environments, protesting in solidarity with your Sangha, following Black Lives Matter's demands of police abolishment by cutting ties with police, social justice, implementing social justice committees or engaged Buddhism committees, determining the line between safety and surveillance, and contributing to mutual aid networks or holding drop-off boxes in our facilities. And these are just some examples of some mutual aid networks in some locations. So in the Chinatown International and in San Francisco, they have community fridges at local public areas or parks and this is a spot where people can take and give food. And these networks are also seeking out for locations to put these fridges. And in Sacramento, this group called the Community Crates has crates located around different spots, and these crates hold essential needs products, menstrual products, hygienic products for people to take and for people to donate. And then this other example is the COVID-19 Mutual Aid Network in LA, and they're seeking for receivers to that they can give their products to and their donations to. And overall is all of these networks are pushing for the wellness and supporting the individuals in the community. And we have a link here where you can find mutual aid networks near you. But these are just some ideas as we go into what our community can do, or what your community can participate in with helping others and reaching out outside of our Sangha.
So that will conclude part 3 and the second half of our workshop. We're going to send you into our second discussion with the following questions. So consider, how do you want to see your Sangha expanding beyond its typical membership? What initiatives do you want your temple and community to take to further advance in their paths towards anti-racism? And ultimately, what will be your role in this work, and how will you support and hold your community accountable for change? Additionally, towards the end of your discussion, there will be a few minutes to talk about this series wrap-up question. Since this is our last workshop, we just want to see and hear what some of your biggest takeaways have been from this workshop or workshop series, depending on how many you've been to. And moving forward, what topics you would want to dive deeper into and discuss more about. So
now for the second discussion. So if you'd like to write in the chat some things that kind of stood out in your group discussions, please feel free, and everyone can kind of read through and see what other groups we're coming up with. I know I'm sorry that some of the discussions were cut short for time, but we hope that everyone was able to get something out of the discussions that they had and can maybe continue with their Sangha members what they can do. I think we can go into the next slide, Stephanie. Here's just our resource list. We'll include this and the presentation in our follow-up email. So if you want to just check out some of the links we have, some articles, please feel free.
And then to really close out our last workshop, we wanted to give a special thank you to the following individuals on behalf of the Young Buddhist Editorial and the YB Social Justice Committee. Each of these individuals really played a crucial role in the development of our Let's Talk About It workshop series. First, thank you to both Seiji and Mariko for helping us put together our content and providing really valuable insight into our workshop facilitation and execution. In particular, thank you to Reverend Matt. Reverend Matt, I think everyone's here, so if you want to turn on your cameras and wave, go for it. But in particular, thank you to Reverend Matt for facilitating our first workshop, to Tara for helping facilitate our second workshop, and to John for facilitating our third workshop. You're each irreplaceable advisors and mentors to us throughout these past 2 months, and I speak for everyone on the Social Justice Committee when I say that we wouldn't have been able to have such a successful series without you.
And finally, we want to extend a thank you to all of you who have registered, supported, and attended our workshop. whether today was your first one or maybe you've been to all 4 of the series. Thank you so much. We're so grateful for your continued support for YBE, and we hope that we hope to bring you all more workshops in the future, and so we can continue this conversation together. So thank you, all of you. And this is just a closing quote, and it's by Ijeoma Oluo, and she said, "We have to learn and fight at the same time." So with that, we'll close out our last workshop of the Let's Talk About It series. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming and sharing.
Thank you all.